Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Food for Thought. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself and our guest today. My name is Perry Mazurkiewicz and I work for SFC. Students for Canada is an advocacy program designed by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We are a group of devoted individuals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in energy and the environment. David Milia is a board member, president, and CEO from the Canadian Energy and Climate Nexus, here to chat about Canada's energy sectors and the pathway forward. Finally, before I hand the floor over to David, please remember that questions can be asked in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. This meeting will be recorded and can be found on our YouTube channel, and parts may be used for our social media channels. So please support us and give us a follow at Students for Canada on any of our social media platforms. Thank you, David.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that great intro, Perry, and thanks, Caitlin. And I still remember Justice, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, who thought I should share what I shared previously here. So thank you for having me. So I changed up the title a little bit because my objective in sharing this is not to tell you what to think, but to give you things to think about, things that have been on the minds of senior leaders for a long time. And I want you to think about what you can do as you hear some of these things in order to progress Canada along, right? What you can do to break some of the polarization that's occurring and take a stand on certain things based on where your passion is, where your competency is, and make Canada something that on the world stage is what it should be. And you'll see why I'm saying that in just a second. But I titled this presentation, even though the content's very similar to what I did back in the day, polarization and energy in Canada, simply put. So very quickly, before we move on to the topic today, I just want to share what the Canadian Energy and Climate Nexus is a little bit about with our belief systems. And we kind of have a group of advisories and a great board that comes from different angles of energy. And we really thought that although difficult, we can balance a climate-friendly energy system in the future with some of the polarized issues that are occurring today, and that it's integral to Canada to get that right and not ignore certain things like economic benefits or the potential that we have. And you'll see why that's so important in just a few minutes. And our core values in order to do that are grounded on inclusivity. That is, everyone gets a chair at the table. They don't have to agree, but they can have something that we describe as respectful conflict. That we will use knowledge, not just have opinions or emotions guide us, but understand that knowledge also applies to the way people feel, to the way that people look at, the political groups that are out there vying for their vote, and that we don't need to be naive about those things. And finally, the first two are great, but if you don't get past them and act on something, then really we're going nowhere. We're just fighting some more. So, like I mentioned, how do you get folks being able to think about stuff and be a bit more progressive, a bit more critical? Now it's a mandate that you hear in all social media where we're fighting polarization, but really when it's spoken about, it's really because somebody's against them. So it's like they're polarized because somebody's against me. So I want to clear that up, and I want the students that are here today to understand what polarization actually is, so that if someone is speaking to you, you can be smarter about defining it. And really, we're looking at, the experts in defining things at Oxford University. Really, polarization is a division into two sharply contrasting groups or sets of opinions or beliefs. That's a nice way of saying that we take something that we care about that is complex, find something within it that speaks to us, and put our flag in the ground and say this is the only pathway forward. And we fight with others who might have looked at the exact same data potentially and put their flag somewhere else. And now we're going to battle each other. We can see this, obviously. The best example I can give you that we're living is COVID. Right? From the same site, you can order yourself a anti-COVID or a COVID t-shirt, same site. I like the way they think because they've been all inclusive to make a profit, right? But really, you can find data that could support why you should be against COVID. And you can find data that supports why you should take vaccines in order to battle COVID. And it's kind of like you pick it, and we talk about it like it's a belief system now. Do you believe COVID is real? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? And then the argument ensues on one piece of data that you pick. This is not uncommon. It happens in politics the most, and particularly when negativity is part of the message. So have you ever seen a negative attack ad? They work because they enrage you to action. They happen in religion. Who would have thought, right? COVID, things that we've seen recently, like Brexit. It happened within Brexit. It happened with regards to Trump's election. It happens with regards to guns and so on and so forth. But today we're going to focus on when it happens with energy and climate. And this is a very polarized topic to tackle. So walk with me today a little bit. And before I start, I want to say that in Canada, there's a big elephant in the group, and it's very much in line to a versus mentality. And there's this idea that energy and climate change are opponents to one another, that there is no way that they can possibly work together given the energy security and the cost for energy that we have today, that we have the privilege of philosophizing about as we sit in our nice warm homes in winter time in Canada, whereas other countries don't have that security. And so what are some of these things that are being talked about? Well, it's always a versus. It's a yes to something, a no to something else. It's something that sometimes we take for granted and say, well, this is a new solution, as though we can flip a switch. And of course, it's such a complex issue, so complex that it's not really a black and white question. And that's why polarization is the enemy, because we've taken an ecosystem that's highly complex of many moving parts and turned it into a yes, no, right, wrong, etc. What we should be trying to have a conversation around is solution alignment. If there's different business structures and challenges for different types of energy, what can certain groups in one energy that are good in one area help another group who is differing in their challenges to do? What if government and regulators could take on the mantle, right, of not doing things based on political outcomes, that is the pursuit of getting into power or retaining the power they have at all levels, whether that be federal or provincial, that turn into swings, right, where taxpayer money is wasted on things that we do with regards to energy, which are big buck items, okay? The role of Indigenous consultation, it's a big landmine at the moment with differing opinions. And of course, we will not go into it in full detail, but all the things around climate change that are affecting this conversation. So I want you to be sort of equipped with the 6 top polarizing narratives that via research have been identified for different angles. And they include, and we've named them this way, but I'm sure you can agree that you might have been exposed to some of these in your day-to-day life. I'd be shocked if you don't recognize some of them, if not all of them. But the first one we call the 6th mass extinction event narrative, which is really foundationally anchored on folks like politicians that might say the world will end in 12 years. I don't know if you've heard that before, or that there's no planet B. And this is a narrative that takes certain data and then pushes you to put a flag in the ground to say climate change overall. This isn't a complex issue, right? But we need to focus on this. Politics don't matter. Markets don't matter. Your well-being doesn't matter, because if we don't have a planet, we won't exist anymore. So that's the narrative, and it's pushed fairly significantly around the world. Canada is just starting to see the rollouts of this narrative, which is firmly in the grasp already of top influencers. The second one is a Canadian one, and you might have heard it, that Canadian or Alberta oil is the most ethical or environmentally responsible or best regulated. Again, it's using truthful data in a fight where you want to promote sort of what you're good at to the world and don't understand why they don't get it, right? And you're trying to promote that they should get it. But where it comes in, it's saying it's one thing over another, yet again, is the narrative when it gets to its extreme definition. The third one is the one that you'll hear from politicians, which is the transition narrative. I am sure everyone's heard of this. This one is sometimes confused with a mass extinction event narrative, but it's not the same. You see, the mass extinction narrative says that's the only thing that exists and that's the only thing to focus on. Whereas transition tries to say, well, we now recognize or think these are bad and we're going to these that are good. And it's kind of making everybody angry because you're saying yes to both sides while meeting the needs of no one. But it's the right thing to do to try to show you're balanced in a political landscape. And this happens everywhere, not just in Canada, okay? This happens in the European Union, it happens in the United States. So we are not alone or unique in this in any way, shape, or form. The fourth one is a narrative that comes from certain data that then pushes that data to say climate change is a myth, like pointing to fossil evidence that there's been different times in the record, in the fossil record, where the earth has warmed or cooled, and saying that this happens and that human beings have no effect on those changes. And so climate change is a bit of a myth. And they point to some of those things. The fifth one is one by Gen Z predominantly. It's called the boomer's legacy narrative, sometimes exemplified as the okay boomer. I'm inheriting a system that antiquated thinking has destroyed, right? And they just need to get out of the way. And exemplified mostly in Gen Z through practicality and millennial groups because of what they inherit in the world, where there's more of a passionate push rather than looking at a transformational push. And finally, there's the narrative of not knowing what the future holds, to seeing things as though constantly evolving. So we don't know what to do. Everything's unpredictable. So let's just take it one day at a time type of thing. Now, all of these, the way I've said it, while I was talking, you felt angry about the way I was describing one or another, then you know which narrative you subscribe to, because that's sort of the test. And I'm a bit flippant and high level talking about them, but that is the test. And I have sat in rooms where I've gone through these in detail and had folks from different narratives stop the meeting and ask to really go down the rabbit hole so that the rest of the group knew how they were right. And sometimes they came from different angles for it. So I can promise you I'm neither for nor against any of these. I am for Canada and mitigating the challenges that all these passionate folks that used good, strong data to put forward and then create a narrative can do together in order to progress Canada. So that's what we're about. And you do that by addressing, you know, the elephant in the room, which is there's a lot of different thinking here. So let's not ignore it, but let's work together towards a new shared value where Canada comes first. If we know there's narratives and we know there's polarization, right? That is, we're becoming more disaligned to each other, right? Should we care about that? Like, is polarization bad? Should we just like fight it out and let there be one winner, right? Well, based on a study done recently on the polarization occurring in the United States, our neighbor to the south, amongst many of the same topics that we're facing here in Canada, they found very deep markers, maybe is the best way to describe it, that showed 14 really negative outcomes of polarization with real examples. And there's a bunch of them here. I'm listing all 14, but I highlighted some that when you look at energy and climate are absolutely crucial and are really hurting our ability to progress in Canada. What happens is that we tend to judge or loathe others who don't think like us. And so if we are trying to collaborate on something and somebody has an equal position to us, right? It's going to be very difficult to work with them if we hate them, right? And in the United States, right, this is really, really escalating quickly, as it is in England, as the top examples. We tend to be less likely to help each other, right? So if you hear someone who's being selfish about something and you care about something else, I am constantly in my work talking about Canada first type of mentalities, right? And when I hear Quebec first, Alberta first, Ontario first, Maritimes first, the North first, I'm always like, super important. But how do they contribute to Canada as a whole? How can they work with other provinces? Not how can they beat up other provinces, right? Or how do they work against other things? So we tend to be less likely to help each other. Believe it or not, it creates more stress for you. You know, and I had a great mentor say one day, when you have that kind of stress because of polarization, because somebody else is doing something that you think is hurting you and the nation, right? It's like you drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, right? Because you're filling yourself with it, whereas the other person sometimes doesn't even care. Now, those are all things that you could say are part of you, right? Things you might carry because of polarized outcomes. But there's a strong amount of evidence that also suggests it's economically hurtful. That is, it's going to hit you in the pocketbooks, right? So our ability to do things in the future, we're burning money like idiots doing this. And it's really hard to solve problems together. So if we actually face something, I don't know, COVID, right? And something becomes polarized, it's extremely hard to have a unified answer when there's a crisis in place, right? That everybody can adhere to, when there's many voices fighting for the right narrative, right? And what tends to happen as an outcome of all of these that I've highlighted lastly here, it's violence. People start hurting each other. And violence isn't always physical, although it includes physical violence. So, going back to my landmarks, polarization exists. We have a bunch of narratives. And now I've kind of tried to demonstrate that it's negative, right? Because maybe polarization is good. Let the winners win and the losers lose. But this is showing that everyone loses when we're polarized. And so really, when we think, oh, geez, well, what does that mean? I want to put to you that there's a lot at stake here with energy in Canada. And I want you to understand what is at stake. Canada is ranked 6th in the world for energy production. We control 20% of clean water for the world. We're not only in the top 10 on oil and gas type of approximations, but we rank right up there on hydroelectricity, on nuclear for the United States. They can't live without us in what we do in Ontario. We also have positions on things like uranium to allow nuclear reactors to have feedstock to work and keep people with their electricity. All of these have challenges, granted, with operations, but all of them right now give us more than what they take. And if we can continue to mitigate the things that are cons on each of these energy sources, rather than judge them as good or bad, while benefiting from what they give us, right? Then perhaps we'd have a better Canada. And when you look at Canada overall, we are already quite divested. No, we're multi cross-sectional on all energy industries. We're not divested of one thing or another. We have everything from coal mines to wind farms to thermal electricity to uranium mines to oil sands to gas. You name it, Canada has it and ranks in the top 10 on most of it. But does Canada sit at the world table of influence as though they do? And how come when the world looks to us, and I can tell you firsthand, I've hosted the Minister of Energy for the United States here. I've hosted the head of commodities and oil from Europe, from BNP Paribas, who divested from Canadian oil sands underwriting here to speak to us. And all of them tell us the same thing. We have a brand problem, and Canadians fight more with themselves, which doesn't look good on international platforms. You know who doesn't do that? Who's proud of both oil and gas and other energy systems they're putting in? Countries like Norway. And when they show up, they're pretty proud of what they do. We've lost all sense of pride in all our energy systems, preferring to fight with each other either regionally or based on industry, where we could do so much with what we have. Other countries would kill to have this. So there's a lot of stake here to get right. Of course, in Canada, we have made some commitments. You might have heard of the Paris Agreement, and we recently finalized COP26. And most of the folks tend to speak, although there's many and complex metrics to look at, they tend to speak around our footprint for emissions. And it's not finite to emissions, but since that vernacular is there, I wanted the people attending this call to understand where we're at, right? And where the gap is. And I want you to know that every piece of data you're seeing today has not been manipulated. You can Google it immediately. And it's from the government of Canada. Literally what you're seeing today is pulled from something called the Energy Fact Book, which Canada has the obligation to put forward, or from their environment plan that looks to amalgamate things. So if you're talking to the Canadian government who went to COP26 and said certain things about targets and all the rest, This is right from their website talking about where we are. And they have targets for 2020. Oh, wait, it's 2021. Oh, well, it's good to see what we used to say for our targets and what we did and what we're saying for the future. I would love to all give you targets for 2100. You know why? Because I won't be here in 2100. So I can say whatever, right? And no matter what I say, it may sound good, but the steps that I take towards meeting that is what we should look at if you're smarter, right? And so when we're looking at that, what is the shortfall? We're in 2020, 1 year ago, when we were in the middle of this virus that's been attacking us, and where we actually had less of a footprint. When you look at these lines, you have sort of where we hoped to be, which was 622. And these are amalgamated MTs, or 1,000 tons, okay, of emissions. And where we actually were, one is sort of the average, one is if the intricacies of government enforcement were in place, so that's blue. And if nothing went unchecked is in red. And as you can see, the best case scenario is a gap there from 747 to 622. And that gap, unfortunately, instead of going lower, is getting higher, regardless of what policies we're putting in. So there's something to be said where you say, oh, well, let's look at the big picture since 2005. And overall, we've had a 9% reduction in CO2. But during that time, we missed a whole economic boat and looking at metrics just from an emission standpoint. Because during that same time, gross domestic product, or the economic health of Canada, increased 56%, right? So it's kind of like, these are trade-offs that we need to think about, right? It's not one or the other, right? It's how we do them in tandem, realistically. To me, it's better to set a realistic target than to promise things and not meet it and say what actually can be there while we benefit in other areas that we are complex in nature. So we're quite on target to fail to meet any targets. So I hope I've given you a picture in concluding here on saying what polarization is, on why we should care about it, about the landscape of what's at stake in Canada, and for you to think about where you can make an impact, because really you're inheriting all this, right? Some of the major problems that will occur during your tenure, right? In leadership, in formation. And so I want to leave you with a little bit of a push that I love doing with all students that I get the pleasure of meeting and who have the stomach to put up with me as I speak. And I'm hoping you might consider the following. One, whenever you look at anything that's sent to you via media or otherwise, ask yourself, is it turning me against someone? Is there a versus or an or to this statement? And try to replace that with an and instead and see what comes out of it. What would happen if we take climate and energy? If we took Indigenous, racist, past infliction of harm and what we can do today for reconciliation instead of one versus the other. So try to replace the or and the versus with an and. Secondly, if you have a position on something and it's well-grounded, look to park it for a second. And if you're speaking to someone that is part of the opposite point of view, think about what might unite you, okay? Even if parking it is difficult, right? Like I tried to exemplify with that vehicle, making a mess of parking. And finally, focus your energy on solutions and collaboration over being right. Being right about something is getting us nowhere, to be honest. We are not gaining any traction, and we're becoming more divided, and we're wasting time and wasting money and hurting each other. And you wrap all this up in this thinking that if you want someone to listen to you, take the time to listen to them, right? And see what they're trying to share with you and win the goodwill to be able to speak what you want to say, and see what you can learn while not shying away from what you think is right, right? You don't have to park your beliefs to do it, right? Just be more professional, more controlled, less angry about things.